Now we are going into the keynote presentation. Jen and Yrjo Engestrom. They are our keynotes. And the keynotes today is organized as a fishbowl. And what is a fishbowl? It's a conversation form which are used to discuss topics within large group. And we are a large group today, so we thought that this fishbowl concept would be a good idea to try out. The advantage of a fishbowl is that all of you somehow is expected to participate in the conversation. It's organized in the way that we have the 5 seats up here, and Jen and Yrjo, they are here, and they cannot be replaced because we have invited them. But then we have myself and we have Chris, and we are somehow starting the fishbowl, and we have prepared a number of entrance discussion points. And then there's a free seat. And then the idea is that as the conversation continues, you are invited to come up here, and the first one can take the free seat, or if you find Chris and myself very irritating, you just push our shoulder, and then we leave, and you take our seat. And then this is the idea that this conversation is going to be dynamic in the sense that as you find it important to bring in a new perspective to the dialogue, you come up and you touch us, and we leave, you sit, another one come up, touch you, leave. We have, normally the fishbowl would be where the group would sit in a circle, but because we want this to be more outspoken, so it's just a half circle this time. And also, we have asked Yrjo and Jen to have their mega many PowerPoints. Not so they're going to give a lot of PowerPoints, but so when they are somehow discussing, then they can just put up one PowerPoint just to maybe help us all to be aware of what they are discussing. Especially because we are many, where English is not our primary language, it's help when we can at the same time follow things on the Okay, and then before we start, I will just say a little bit about Yrjo and Jen. I guess most of you somehow know them, maybe not personally, but I guess you have been reading, you have been following their work. Yrjo, he's the professor of adult education, and he's the director of the Center for Activities Theory and Development Work Research at the University of Helsinki. And he's also professor of communication at the University of California, San Diego, and served as a director of the Laboratory of Comparative Human Cognition. And he's also honorary professor in the School of Education at the University of Birmingham. But what is most, I think he is very well known for his theory of expansive learning. The first time I, in fact, met Yrjo, I know, Yrjo don't know we have met, but it was in a tutorial in Tampere in the late 80s or beginning of the 90s. And at that time, I was very happy because it was the first time I really found a learning theory where the technology perspective was integrated. And also the activity system model, it seemed to be a very strong analytical tool. So I have in that sense been following the work of Yrjo, and a lot of my students and PhD students have been using your work. And then with Etienne, as many of you know, is a global lead, I would say, in the field of community of practice. And he has been, I would say, one of the fathers to this concept. He's authored a lot, co-authored very important books. The first one was the Situated Learning. Then the next one with this community of practice, learning, meaning and identity. And also a more practical book on the cultivating communities of practice. And the last one on digital habitats, on technology for communities. I met Etienne in 1993 in the very, for me, very important department. Yeah, department. Institute for Research on Learning in Palo Alto. And it was very important in a double sense. First, because this concept of community of practice, it was very inspiring, and especially it was interesting to get a new perspective. We were struggling with our PBL, but then with this concept of community of practice, suddenly you could start to see new ways of looking at the PBL. But also because IRL, as this very stimulating academic place, they also tried, they were not only discussing communities of practice and the theoretical concept, they were also trying to live it. So, yeah. So, I hope that today we will manage to have a very good discussion among our two guests and also with you. And I hope that we can get very deep into to understand the different approaches to learning and technology, and to somehow see how they relate, conflict, so we can use that to come further in the understanding of learning. So, with this short presentation, we are going to start.
Yeah, I'm just for practical purposes, I'm wondering whether we should do that fishbowl standing, because the people in the back really will maybe have one of those tables.
Yeah.
You know,
This
and stand around the table.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be better for you in the back if we did that?
Yeah.
It's not the traditional. The traditional fishbowl is sitting, but the traditional fishbowl does not have so many rows. When fish is in a row, you know, it's a circle normally. So.
Then I forgot to say that we are starting, so Yrjo and Etienne, they get 10 to 15 minutes to give an introduction to the work, and then the discussion will start.
Etienne asked me to start, and I will. Basically, this kind of a situation is difficult because we have to try to capture rather complex ideas in a very short time. And I hope that during the discussion, which we have plenty of time for the discussion, this will be then made more concrete. But I don't think that we really have, at least I don't feel that I have a chance to go into concrete examples very much. But when we have the discussion, maybe I can take up some concrete examples, at least very briefly. So I'm going to talk about expansive learning, and that's an approach, a theory, that tries to understand forms of learning which are not traditionally captured by theories of learning. Namely, the types of learning in which human beings and human communities are involved in actually reconstructing their entire activities. These kinds of learning are traditionally not even considered learning, because our traditional notions of learning are very deeply limited by ideas of school learning. in which there's always been a curriculum, textbooks, teachers who know the right answers, and the students are supposed to acquire the existing knowledge. Now in today's world, we live in the midst of continuous transformations of our activities, and learning increasingly has to deal with situations in which the outcomes of learning are not known ahead of time, but are actually constructed while we learn. This diagram here tries to capture some of this multiple fields of learning, so to speak. And I'm using here two dimensions. The horizontal dimension is between learning for an existing activity and learning for something that will happen in the future, learning for a new or future activity. And the vertical dimension depicts the distinction between what is often called, especially in organizational learning, it's called exploitation versus exploration. Namely, at the bottom there is exploitation of existing knowledge, and at the top there is exploration of new knowledge. And when you put together these two dimensions, you get the four-field, in which traditional school learning represents exploitation of existing knowledge for a new activity, namely, typically for something that the students, the learners, the children, do not yet quite understand why we have to learn this, but the adults tell them that this would be good for you. You will definitely need this in the future. So this is learning for activities which are typically not quite yet present-day reality for the learners. On the left-hand side, at the bottom, what I call apprenticeship learning. The typical forms of apprenticeship learning deal with novices entering existing activities. For instance, existing productive activities, existing work settings. And the task of the learner is to acquire the master's knowledge, so to speak, to become gradually more and more like the master. On the top left-hand side, when I talk about problem and project-based learning, typically that's where we enter the exploration of new knowledge, but largely for the purpose of serving existing activity, making the existing activity better or making the participants more competent. If you think about problem-based learning in many medical schools, for instance, the learners are not there to change radically the profession of medicine, but to become better at it, become more independent, competent problem solvers in the existing profession of medicine. Expansive learning faces the double challenge of learning something for activities which are not yet there, and therefore exploiting new knowledge for that. Exploring new knowledge for that. These are typically situations in which, let's say, communities or organizations are facing a major transformation, a radical change. The end point of that change is not fully known to anybody. And if you look at any workplace, organization, or practically any kind of human community today, you see more and more of this happening. We know that we will go into a period of radical change, a lot of uncertainty is involved, perhaps our whole existence is threatened, and we need to redefine ourselves as a community, as an organization, as an activity. And those processes of learning I call expansive learning. Of course, there's no automatic guarantee that there will be an expansive outcome. Those kinds of learning processes are risky, poorly understood, and we don't really have very many tools to support them. They are not the kind of learning that we kind of get used to as children and students. So the basic point here is that standard learning theories, they fail to explain learning processes where new forms of practice are created and organizations are radically transformed. So the expansive learning as a framework, it puts learning into the transformations in activity systems. Learning is intertwined and fully embedded in major transformations. So this is not a theory that tries to explain all learning. It's focused in very particular kinds of learning situations, which are becoming more and more pervasive and at the same time more and more challenging to the whole humanity. Learning is oriented at the object of activity. In other words, you really need to master what people are engaged in. You need to change something, like for instance a workplace, a work activity. It's not just fooling around to get some interesting new ideas. It is in that sense very deeply focused. Learning can be understood as collaborative creation of new patterns of activity, and it's driven by contradictions in the present activity. I need to emphasize this very much. It is not typically an easy and smooth and benign process. It is a process driven by contradictions. Learning is initiated by mundane disturbances and deviations which grow bigger and start to push the practitioners to face a situation of radical change. You can think of this kind of learning as a longitudinal journey through a collective zone of proximal development, to paraphrase Vygotsky's famous concept of zone of proximal development. And it's realized by means of what we call expansive learning actions. In other words, learning is not, expansive learning is not an arbitrary process. It has certain kinds of actions embedded in it which can be analyzed and facilitated. And the facilitation of this kind of learning calls for longitudinal interventionist methodologies. One of those is what we have been practicing in my research center for about 15 years, which we call the Change Laboratory. In other words, to sum up, expansive learning is learning what is not yet there. The object of activity is qualitatively transformed so as to open up a horizon of wider possibilities and new actions. It is a collaborative creation of new concepts and patterns of activity, driven by contradictions in the present activity. Lengthy journey, and the expansion happens in multiple dimensions, socio-spatial dimension, meaning that the object of the activity becomes bigger in size and encompasses more actors. Temporal dimension, the object becomes more durable and spans a longer period of time. And ethical, political dimension, possible consequences of the new object require new kinds of responsibility from the practitioners. Think about, for instance, the changes in healthcare. When now more and more the traditional idea of healthcare as curing a specific disease in a limited period of time has to give way to the understanding that we're dealing with chronic diseases. People will have these for decades. And healthcare has to cope with, for instance, the radical explosion of diabetes type 2, which means that it has to deal with much more longitudinal objects. Type 2 diabetes, people live with that for decades. It has to create networks of support for these patients. It's not a sort of one-man show. It is much more complicated, creating kind of social support networks as part of the medical endeavor. And radically new kinds of responsibility are involved because you're dealing with a phenomenon which is constantly out of hand, out of control. So here is a simplified image of the steps or learning actions of an ideal typical cycle of expansive learning. It starts with questioning the existing practice. When the contradictions are aggravated, they have to be analyzed and you have to make sense of them, which leads to a modeling of a new way of behaving and acting, examining and testing the model, implementing, reflecting, consolidating. This looks like a simple linear process. Of course, in reality, it's nothing but linear, nothing but simple. Models of this kind, sequential models of learning, are dangerous because they tend to give an image of a relatively well-controlled linear process. On the other hand, they are necessary if you want to analyze what really is going on. You have to have a sort of a theoretical, ideal, typical model which then constantly is proven to be wrong, because reality is much more complicated and not at all linear. So I think that I more or less exceeded my time, and it's your turn.
Okay, so I'll try to be brief so that we can enter into a discussion, but I just wanted to say a few things. It was interesting. We had a PhD seminar here at Aalborg University in the last 2 days, and I think a lot of the conversations we were having was sort of what is the role of theory in research, and how does a PhD student understand theory? And for me, I was because I'm often asked, so what should I use as a theory? Should I use activity theory? Should I use Latour's actant network? Should I use communities of practice? And to me, I think that's the key to that answer is what kind of story about the world are you trying to tell? Because one of the students was saying, I'm going to use communities of practice because I'm going to talk about collaboration. And my response was, no, don't bother. The theory of communities of practice is not about collaboration. There are theories in social psychology about group dynamics that will work fine for that. If you want to use the concept of community of practice, you would use it, for instance, in PBL approach to talk about the identity of a teacher as the representative of a certain community in that room, not to talk about the group dynamics among the students, because that's not what communities of practice is about. Communities of practice is about who are you as a teacher, and what is your role as a teacher in representing in that room the gaze of a certain community on a problem. Whether the students are learning that or not is a different question. But you as a teacher, one of your roles, the roles that would be well described by the kind of theory that I'm developing, is what is the role of the teacher in being in that room, the representative of a community who has a history of looking at these kind of problems, and can therefore, with their own identity, with who they are as a learner, bring that into the room. And so, if you think of the kind of professional learning that, for instance, Aalborg University is involved in, this diagram was created one day when I was at the Open University in the UK, and they were asking me, so what would your theory say about the kind of professional learning that we are trying to create for our students? And you know that the Open University has made a name for itself in curriculum development by taking something complex like nursing or teaching or something like this and translating that into a well-designed curriculum. So they have been very good at refining, if you will, the body of knowledge of a profession. But for me, from my theory, it's great. I think the Open University has been doing a great job. But if it wants to start thinking about what it is doing into the future, it may have to start thinking, what is the body of knowledge of a profession? And so I did this diagram to kind of say, well, but look at the body of knowledge of a profession. It is what I would call a landscape of practices. There are very, very different kinds of practices that are all having a claim to that territory. And I think that would work for healthcare as it would work for teaching, probably for engineering too, that you have certain research disciplines that are producing research on what nursing should be about, or what teaching should be about, what engineering should be about. You have places that are forming new members of these practices. That's often the role of the university. You have professional bodies that are developing a kind of collective identity around certain professions. You have regulatory bodies that are trying to develop regulations that are also colonizing that field of practice, if you will, from their perspective. And of course, you have workplaces where management, for instance, also has a say about what should be happening. So in some sense, you could view a nurse or a teacher as someone who is representing for a patient, for a student, for whoever they are interacting with, a whole landscape of practices, and are, if you will, in each moment of their practice, reliving all the boundaries of this landscape and resolving for a given patient the demands of accountability of these different places. Or does the regulation apply here? Should management's request to save on test be followed for this patient? You see what I mean? There are different forms of accountability that exist in that landscape, and that are all having a claim on moments of practice, if you will. And of course, one of the interesting things about the world today, and if we want to talk about ICT, one of the things that ICT is doing, is that it is kind of complexifying that landscape. Because all of a sudden, if you are a nurse in a hospital, should you follow the Twitter feed of your colleague in Africa? Is this part of your responsibility as a professional, to feel accountable to the blog of the Minister of Health? You know what I mean? So the management of knowledgeability, if you will, as a system of accountability to different places in the landscape, then is actually complexifying. And I would say that this development of multiplicity of places of accountability and places of identification is actually an important characteristic of the 21st century, that in some sense places more of the work on individuals than in the past. So I think we are seeing an evolution here from the point of view of identity. And then means that from this perspective, there are different carriers of knowledgeability in the world. And so for me, a social practice is actually a carrier of knowledgeability, but so is your identity. So if you think of the world as a landscape of practices, each practice is the carrier of some form of knowledgeability, some claim to knowledge, some claim to competence. And you as a person, you are kind of traveling that landscape, crossing boundaries, embodying these boundaries in your own experience of the world, reliving them in your own identity. And therefore your identity as a travel, if you will, as a trajectory through the world, becomes a reflection of the landscape, but a lived reflection of the landscape, and in that form becomes itself a distinct carrier of knowledgeability than each practice in particular. So it's in that interaction between these different forms of these different carriers of knowledgeability that you find interesting learning from this perspective. And so, in some sense, you could say that knowledgeability, this perspective on knowledgeability, and that's where I'm telling the Open University, maybe there is something to think about the role of the university in helping people find a place in that landscape, because in a definition of knowledgeability from this perspective is the modulation of your identification with different places in the world. You see what I mean? So you have to oh, that was not supposed to happen. That was the surprise in the end. No, but you see, there I am. Like if I take myself at the center of the universe, which I usually do, I have all these places of accountability. You know what I mean? And in some sense, I have to modulate my identification you see, to understand where I'm accountable. Because you see, like, you know, for me, I'm here, I'm giving this talk to an academic audience. And how accountable am I to the academic world? I don't live in the academic world. I'm not a professor in a university. I don't have pressure to write all sorts of papers just for the sake of having 4 papers a year in a journal or whatever. I don't have that kind of accountability. So how accountable am I to you, you know, and to your world and to the things that are important to you, you know, as opposed to a client of mine who was asking me, you know, we have this committee of practice that's kind of not doing very well. Can you help us, you know? And so I am living my life a lot as managing accountability. And, you know, for me, my tweet deck is a tool of management of accountability. Should I follow Griney's super productive Twitter stream, you know what I mean? She is marginally in what I would call my community, or at least my landscape, and I have to make a choice what I'm going to do with my time. And Grine is a very productive Twitter feed. So I'm constantly, from the point of view of my identity, managing who I am as a knowledgeable person, as an accountable person to myself and to these places of colonization of the landscape of knowledgeability, if you will. So I thought I would end, because I'm always asked, you know, what's the difference between you and Yrjo, and what's the difference between you and Latour, and what's the difference between you and George Siemens and whatever. So I just give you a little bit of my take on that, you know, because I always ask me, what's the difference between a network and a community of practice? What's the difference between a community of practice and an activity? So I thought I'd just give you a bit of my take on that without any claim to a final solution. But I think that the way to understand that is really to understand different stories about the world. Because I don't think it's very useful to think what is a network and what is a community as 2 different kind of structure. Is this a network or is this a community? That is not very interesting, because you can debate that for a very long time, because most, or what is a network, a community of practice and what is an activity, because most systems, social systems, will have aspects of all 3. You see what I mean? So to me, it is more interesting to see what kind of story do you want to tell about a system, and then say what are the salient aspects of it, because there are things that are clearly communities, right, and not so much activities, because there are communities where negotiating a shared object is not very salient. As long as I gain something from rubbing shoulders with you, I don't care if you are leading to the same goal as me, you know, because somebody was asking me, so he was talking about some work that he was doing in Africa, and he was looking at entrepreneurs in Africa, you know, and he saw that those entrepreneurs were really sort of good at starting little businesses, but they also had this amazing conversation in the cafe, you know, and he was telling me, what should I use, activity theory or should I use communities of practice, you know, and I was saying, well, it depends again on what story you're going to tell. If you talk about these people building a business, I think activity theory is a lot better, because the negotiation of what these people are going to do, you know, is going to be central to their ability to run a business. But if you want to talk about these conversations that they are having in the cafe, then why? Because he was wondering, why are these people sharing all this knowledge with their competitors, when actually they have competing objects rather than collaborative objects? And yet in the cafe they have all these conversations about what's going on. So their identity, I have a sense of identity with you, is a better way to tell the story of why these people are even talking, rather than to force yourself to find a common object that is going to explain the cohesion of the collaboration. Same thing, you know, with a community and a network. Most communities are also networks. Many networks are also communities. There are extremes, right? So, you know, people will ask me, so is Twitter, the Twitter world, a community of practice? I think it's not a very interesting way to talk about it. You know, well, there is a slight sense of identification. Oh, I'm a Twitterer because it's new, you know. So it does influence your identity. Oh, I have 566 followers or whatever, you know. But I think if you think about the knowledgeability as the modulation of accountability and the modulation of identification, what matters if you are in the Twitter world is, do I retweet this? See what I mean? So a networked approach is not so much who else is interested in that domain, who else has a kind of collective identity. It's a much more local sense of like, how do I deal with my direct connections? You see what I mean? So that's a networked view, you know? And it creates different, if you have this view of the world, and what I've tried to do is to kind of show that these different stories, and again, for me, often about the same structures, about the same groups, if you will. If you take group to be a kind of general, neutral term, you know, then you have different kind of vocabulary, you know, and I have tried to express a little bit of that kind of vocabulary that for me I tend to develop for the kind of stories of learning as identity that I'm interested in developing. So for me, identity is really a core element, whereas in activity, perhaps object is the core driver of the activity. And in network, it's these notions of flows. You know, so Latour talks about translation, enlistment, an object, not in an activity sense, but just a thing, right? You know, so activity theory will tend to talk about tools. How does it serve the activity? For me, I tend to talk about reification. How does this embody the negotiation of meaning in a way that gives it some kind of solidity? You know, that's for me what an artifact is. It's a point of negotiation whose physicality or whose conceptuality or linguistic congealing provoked a place for negotiation, if you will. But an object in a networked view is much more like a translator. It's like a node in a series of flows of social energy and influence. So a door, to use Latour's example, a door is a node in a network of flows of intentionality, where all of a sudden that door represents all these flows, like, oh, you know, the door is my door. I paid for it and I put a lock on it. Why did I put a lock on it? Because I have money in my house. Why do I have money in my house? Because I want to buy things, but other people want to buy things too. So if you see that door as a node in a network of flows and translations, so that door translates for the robber all these intentions, if you will, that for a moment are congealed in that door. So you have different views of objects in these different stories, different views of the person. The person is a subject of an activity and therefore has a dialectical relationship with the activity, forming the subject in that dialectical moment of engagement. In network theory, a person is also a node. You know, you think you exist, but by the way, you know, you're just a node in a system of flows, you know, and you are just a mediator of multiple flows. You know, when you think you buy your candy or something like this, you're not alone in a network. And for me, sort of a person is this negotiation of a multi-membership view of the world. To how do you become a person out of that multiplicity of forms of belonging? So anyway, I just wanted to get the discussion going by saying these are different vocabularies because they're telling different stories about the world, and I don't think it's very useful first to think whether something is a network, a community, or an activity. It's much more saying how do these three elements, these three views, combine in that place, and what story do you want to tell, you know? And so I just wanted to open up this conversation here by trying to express these different perspectives.
Just you could just let it stay for a second. Yeah, because we are very soon going to have a coffee break. But just before the coffee break, I would like, because in fact I had prepared one question. In fact, my question to you was somehow.
I think we should all stand here.
Yeah, we could try.
Yeah. Let's have a conversation around a coffee. A beer table.
A beer table, yeah. Okay. Yeah, because my first question was exactly where you ended. What is somehow the relation, or what to say, between the concept of activity system and the community of practice? And especially if you are a student, for instance, or a researcher, is it possible to combine your approaches, or would you say it gives me more meaning to have one of the approaches as your overall in framework, or you say the way you look into your problem? Yeah, so that was, and I think it's very much related. So maybe Yrjo should somehow give a response to what you were saying in your presentation.
I think it was very useful what Etienne said about what you said about those different and in a way complementary views that and certainly any social scientist should be aware that theories of this magnitude are not reducible to one another. You cannot just simply claim that one of them is better than the other in some sense, because they are in a way incommensurable. There is no way to find a grand theory that would melt them together. On the other hand, I think that it is useful to have a critical dialogue between these various approaches, and it's dangerous if they become completely isolated and insulated from one another, which also tends to happen too often. A good example is actor network theory, because it happens to be of French origin, and French colleagues are well known for saving the world alone. So for instance, in my approach, in the activity theory approach, several times we initiated dialogues, but they tended to be our commentaries on them without too much response. But once I did a special issue about Bruno Latour's work, and then we put commentaries on his main article. And well, he did answer, but he was not very happy with the commentaries. And it's I think it would be useful in this day and age for all of us to try and learn to do at least a sort of minimum boundary crossing between these theories, even though we have to acknowledge that they are incommensurable also. As to communities of practice and expansive learning certainly does happen in and between communities. Perhaps there is to add what Etienne already said about the different emphasis or different points of view. There's also a strong emphasis on historicity in expansive learning and activity theory more generally. In other words, we worry a great deal about what kind of a community are we talking about, because different communities are radically different. If we think about the sort of classical Gemeinschaft type community, which is really a village or people who live in the same place for long periods of time, and basically, like Etienne said, for them asking for a common object is kind of ridiculous, because the common object is their shared existence itself. But then when you move to a more, if you want, modern types of communities, rational Weberian types of Gesellschaft communities, there you have a lot more explicit rules, and the objects, the explicit objects, what the aims and aspirations of what you try to achieve together become much more salient and important. And therefore, you might say that these two historical forms of community are indeed radically different, and we should be aware of that. Today, we might talk about even, again, different types of community. Paul Adler and others talk about collaborative communities when they try to understand what is happening in organizations when when they really start seeking trust and collaboration across organizational boundaries. And if you go to social media and the world of the Web 2.0, of course, you encounter communities which are often called communities for the lack of a better word, but what they can be anything from Facebook to something where people are actually trying to achieve something together. And so at times it seems almost like we badly need a sharper vocabulary for communities to distinguish historically different communities from one another. So this is just my little worry about let's not get overly enthusiastic about just the fact that there are communities.
Mm-hmm. You want to add?
Yeah, I'm not especially enthusiastic about the fact that there are communities.
You should by now learn.
Because I've seen many of them. So there's nothing romantic about the notion of a community, at least in this theory. There's nothing good about being a community. That's why I don't talk about collaborative communities, because for me collaboration is not a characteristic of a community of practice. A community of practice can be very conflictual. Many communities split out of conflicts that happen, although that's not necessarily a common occurrence, because there is a strong need to work things out. But yeah, I think that when we develop a theoretical vocabulary, we have to be very careful. So for me, collaboration is not part of my theory. You see what I mean? So we were talking yesterday about reflection. What about reflection? Isn't reflection so important? Should it be part of your theory? Well, no. It's when you put something in the foundation of the theory, then it's something that is no longer questionable in some sense. So you have to be very, very careful. People were saying, but shouldn't you call your communities communities of excellence rather than communities of practice? We talk about communities of excellence because it's like, okay, fine. But if something is a community of excellence, it's very difficult to then question whether it's excellence or not. See what I mean? So for me, it's better to say, oh, they have a practice. That I can assume. But whether that practice is collaborative, whether that practice is excellence, it's something I want to be able to question. Whether that practice is learning, I want to be able to question that, rather than build it into the theory. So as theorists, we have to be very, very careful what we build into the theory and what we don't. And I think aware that any vocabulary that we develop does have baggage, because we use, I could call communities of practice jab boom blibouv. It would just work as well. See what I mean? It would be more difficult intuitively for people to come along, but jab boof blibouv would work, you see? But of course the term community then calls upon notions of identity, calls upon notion of collective caring about something. So it's useful, but it also calls upon things like, oh, then we are all loving each other, and or it's us versus them, which happens too. But there are diseases of a community, in some sense, more than fundamental characteristics.
Could I ask? Is it to be maybe a little simplistic, but from my point of view, maybe when you have, for instance, you want to understand changes in an organization, I feel I can use Yrjo's approach in order to understand and identify the various activity systems in the organization. And also, you say, from an historical point, maybe identify the contradictions and the conflicts. And I feel I can use your approach more to understand the daily life or the inside this organization, inside the different activity system.
I don't think that's true, because I think that activity theory also talks about daily life, but from a different standpoint. Mm-hmm. So if you want to start doing the kind of work that Yrjo is doing in an organization, I think you're going to have to take into account the fact that the people that you're talking about, they're not just members of that activity. They have accountability to communities that have an important grab on their identity. So they're not just like free agent who can just say, oh yeah, there's a contradiction, yes, thank you, yeah, let's resolve it. There is a history also to that person and to being part of a practice, you know? And so you're going to have to take that into account in the same way that when I talk about an identity, I have to say that that identity is lived in certain institutional structures and activity structures where it can be expressed only in certain ways. You know what I mean?
All right.
I was going to ask about the origins of your theories, because there is this, you were in a common place, you were in California at approximately the same time. So it can look, in retrospect, you are identified with these particular brands almost. So there's the communities of practice brands, there's the cultural historical activity theory brand, but you actually have this root in a place, a physical place, and in a spiral of ideas that was happening at the time. So I wanted to ask you a little bit, if you could tell us a little bit about those common origins and what the relationships were as your theories developed. Because now we look back and they're fixed and firm and you're identified with these things, but there must have been a swirl of ideas from which these emerged. So could you tell us a little bit about the place of both of you in these origins?
Well, yeah, it's true that we were both in the late 80s and early 90s in California. At the end was at IRL, Institute for Research and Learning in Palo Alto, and I was at UC San Diego, and we did interact, and it was a very exciting time because there was a network of people who were interested in similar things, and very bright people got together in various kinds of occasions, and IRL played an important role. So did also UC San Diego, some institutions there, etc. But I would be a bit scared about this, putting the origins in there. For instance, I came to San Diego in 1987, and I had already written Learning by Expanding, the book which laid out the basic ideas of expansive learning, and this happened in Finland, paradoxically much more under the influence of Soviet Union than the influence of sunny Southern California, and I'm very proud of that too, because I think that it's very dangerous to hand over to the to Americans everything, which we tendentially tend to do. Mostly they are good at destroying the stuff. So, but basically, or commercializing it. But
of which I'm accused of. No, but I'm accused of commercializing and destroying.
I'm going to give a few snipes at you because I have this cold, so don't worry. So basically, but it's true that it was a very important, let's say, fertile growing ground for these ideas. Jean Lave, Mike Cole, many others who are still there, although I'm getting a bit old maybe. Whereas we are just getting younger all the time. But I think that's largely a coincidence that many things concentrated in that area for a period of roughly 10 years.
Yeah, and I would say that your book was a central reading at IRL. Vygotsky's work was very central to the kind of things we were studying, as were Bourdieu and Latour also, and Foucault and some of those French sociologists, and Marx even. We were reading Das Kapital actually. So. But I think we were coming from different places, you know, because I think you were coming very much, I think, from a Marxist transformative perspective, and
Still am.
Still am. Yes, absolutely. And we were coming much more from an anthropological perspective. I mean, Jean Lev was an anthropologist. She had enormous influence on me. Actually, maybe her name has not been mentioned enough because you know, I mean, sometimes I feel I'm just a continuation of her in certain ways. And we were looking at anthropological studies of communities, and we were not seeing the kind of benevolent interaction between an adult and a child that were characteristic of the kind of early studies of Vygotsky. And so, because at first we were going to use the zone of proximal development idea also to talk about these communities, but it didn't quite work, because that's where actually the term, for us, the term legitimate peripheral participation was a sort of anthropological alternative to the notion of zone of proximal development, because in many of those communities the masters didn't care about their apprentices. You know, it's not like they were teaching them anything or scaffolding. It was like, okay, you go run an errand for me. You know what I mean? You do something, like try to sew that button, you know, and if you can't do it, ask that person, you know what I mean, and try to find someone, you know. So in a way the community was scaffolding the apprentice, but not in that kind of very observable, direct way. So we, I think from an anthropological perspective, then moved away from the notion of zone of proximal development and started to talk about issues like legitimate peripheral participation. And I have to say that Yrjo also, one of my memories of Yrjo was because actually the conference at which we first presented the concept of community of practice, when it first came out, was actually organized by Yrjo in San Diego, you know. 1988, 88, yeah. And so one of the memory of Yrjo was that
I was attacking.
that he was like, whoa, this is completely wrong. No, because Jean Lev, I was you know, a little graduate student, just is even skinnier than I am now, and Jean Lev left. You know, we presented the paper, and Tamar, she had to leave, and so she left me behind. And so Yrjo was kind of saying, you can't do this. You know, you can't in an industrial or even post-industrial world. You cannot talk about apprenticeship, which is a craft. And for me, you know, I thought I had understood Max Paspori, I hadn't. So I didn't have this notion of historical periods with modes of production and infrastructure and superstructure and all that. So it was like, whoa, so it's unallowed, you know, to talk about this. It was very developmental for me. And then to say, okay, then in what way is it still allowed? In what way can I...
Are you sure I used the word allow?
No, I'm not sure. That was a long time ago. But you were basically saying this
Golden
is wrong.
memories, I think.
This is theoretically wrong or something like this.
Yeah, well, I was saying that you're idealizing something which is not at all so ideal. And in fact, you wrote, you did some minor changes in the manuscript after that. Yeah. Very minor, actually. I was basically arguing that when you talk about legitimate peripheral participation and you depict that the only movement is from the periphery toward the center, what about those who run away and break out, and that there is movement also which is not from the periphery to the center but out?
Absolutely.
And they did add, well, I think, like 2 sentences.
Well, no.
Probably not because of my comment, but because...
No, but I think... Yeah, I think what happened then is that, at least in my own work, the foreground, background changed, okay? And so I think that what we were doing in 1980 88 was sort of taking the community for granted and then saying, how do you become a member?
Yeah.
And I think that later, an important evolution of the theory has been to no longer take the community for granted, to say that the community itself is a product of learning, and therefore learning becomes the fundamental. Instead of using the community to explain learning, at least in my 1998 book, I use learning as the formative process of the community, and therefore I problematize the community itself, and therefore learning is no longer a trajectory in, but it's going to be a trajectory
There is a
out.
big difference between the situated learning book and the communities of practice book in that respect. That, like you said, the situated learning book was, I think that you were so fascinated by this discovery that communities became a little bit reified, and then you later moved away from that. But it's important to know, because often people start with the 1991 book because it is very accessible, and it still has that kind of programmatic quality that communities are depicted almost as if ideal forms. But that's of course a long time ago, and you can blame Jean for that mainly because she's the first one.
No, absolutely. No. And her work has evolved as well.
I was thinking that we should, because we have the coffee break and we are already a little late, so I think this would be a natural point now to make the coffee break. And I will ask you to be back a 11:15. 15 minutes. Then they will be here in 20.